Larry is not what you might call a bomb thrower. Larry's Larry's more of a very traditional Republican, and he's going to be, as I said, very thoughtful and deliberate. I don't think he's prone to flights of wild fancy like Toby would have been.
We're back with another episode of Searchlight Report, a podcast from South Dakota Searchlight that brings you up to date on policy and politics in the Mount Rushmore state. I'm your host, Megan O'Brien. South Dakota Republicans have their nominee for governor 8 weeks after the primary election. None of the 4 candidates pulled the 35% of votes needed to win June's primary election outright. That pushed the top 2 vote-getters, Governor Larry Rhoden and businessman Toby Doeden, to the state's first ever runoff election in a statewide race. Rhoden surged ahead after receiving 25% of the votes in the primary to receive 71% of the votes in the runoff. Rhoden will face Democratic nominee Dan Ahlers in the November election. South Dakota voters haven't elected a Democratic governor since 1974. Republican political commentator Pat Powers has written for the South Dakota War College blog for more than 20 years. He joined me to talk about what he took away from the runoff election. Okay, just to start, thanks for joining again. I appreciate you taking the time. It was kind of an early night. It seemed to just kind of closed and everything.
I think that was a historic first for how early Minnehaha County was able to get their election results in. Nobody was saying we needed a hand count or anything. They just put it all in the machine and it was done in 9:30, 10 o'clock, and Minnehaha was in.
Yeah. And we saw the polls of Rhoden being ahead, and that ended up kind of coming true last night. I guess what are your reactions to the results?
Well, I guess they were not fake. I think the results last night came about because ultimately the Doeden campaign, they stayed with their 30%. Maybe they peeled off a few people, but they stayed at 30. And I think that's evidence of the fact that they really didn't do any outreach to any of the other campaigns. I mean, they might have said they did, but I was originally a Dusty voter, and I know I sure didn't see any outreach to the people who supported Dusty in the campaign, nor did they really go after the Hanson people, except in a little lip service. So, and I think the quote was, I've got to scroll back a little. The quote on election night, where Toby, I think it was, the agenda was set, the die was cast when he declared on election night in June that I ended Dusty Johnson's political career. And, he had won. I think in South Dakota, we don't necessarily like sore winners. Here was a time that he should have been reaching out and gracious and saying, we can work together on things, agree where we can agree. No, he was kind of trying to dance on Dusty's figurative political grave. And I think a lot of people understand that, there might have been one election lost, but there's plenty of time in the future for, maybe if Dusty decides to run for office again, that he may be well received. And here's all of his supporters that Toby was kicking in the teeth. I don't think that helped him, and he wasn't reaching out in any similar fashion to the John Hanson voters. So, here we have an island, and he never was able to grow past it. Yeah, and there's other parts of it too. I thought the advertising on Toby's side really didn't capitalize on his win on election night. And again, the same problem, not bringing people to his cause. It was just more of the same. And I really didn't think the commercials were that great coming in on this second part of the primary. And so it just kind of laid there and never was able to go past that initial 30%.
Right. There's two things from that I want to pull from. You'd mentioned him talking to, or kind of talking about Dusty Johnson after Doeden's win. Doeden had also posted on social media that he'd tried to get John Hanson as his lieutenant governor 3 separate times. Do you think that played a role in maybe getting or losing any of those Hanson voters?
Again, I he might have given it lip service, but I don't know that anybody really saw that. As other than a statement. We also saw it along those lines when he was talking about who he'd asked to be lieutenant governor. He brought up Casey Crabtree. I wonder if Casey was aware of this. There's never any real indication that he'd talked to these people, or we didn't have any statements from them coming out and saying that they were interested. He had been courting uh, Taffy Howard for the entire election, and at the Republican convention had been filming commercials with her. I mean, they were on camera with his big filmers uh, doing a few pieces, and that I don't think there's a delegate there who didn't know that. So I saying that, Casey and Jason Williams from the treasurer's office were potentials. I I don't know that anybody talked to those people about that.
And you also, in thinking about the advertising during this little stretch of the campaign here, last time during the primary, you'd said that no one had really taken the chance to define Toby Doeden, and then that was kind of an advantage for him. I think you'd kind of brought up the Rounds Kirby Barnett
Mhm.
analogy of Rounds kind of flew under the radar. Kirby and Barnett kind of were dogging it out with each
Yeah.
other. Do you think that played out at all this
Well,
time?
I think Larry Larry's team had they'd taken a few more hits at Toby than maybe Toby had gotten in the previous part of the cycle, but you notice I don't think they were strident about it. It wasn't the complete focus, but they were sure out there talking about what Toby would do and calling him taxing Toby and things like that. There was a more defined effort to try to say this is what you're going to get, and also calling him out on some of his uh, plans in terms of, well, what will the Toby tax proposals do to South Dakota? Again, things that he was not challenged on before, which there are those of us who would write about it and say this is ridiculous, this is not even constitutional, when he would talk about taxing people from out of state differently than he would tax South Dakotans. And so there was more of a focus on maybe digging into some of those proposals a bit further than they had in the first part of the primary. I mean, this was just such unheard territory. I mean, I think a lot of us were feeling there was voter fatigue, but if you look last night, uh, that 30% is better than we had gotten in the 2024 primary. Uh, and we had we didn't have to go to a runoff there, and we had 17% there, and it completely overturned the legislature. Well, now we've had better turnouts, turning the legislature back. I mean, I'm not going to call it the death knell of the populist movement in South Dakota, but they definitely suffered some setbacks in South Dakota. Uh, and maybe here in January, if we keep a lot of these new Republicans who were elected, it might be actually a productive session where, it's maybe a little less crazy, and they try to get some things accomplished.
And can you explain a little bit more about populism for listeners that don't know? Can you explain a little bit about what it is and how you're kind of seeing that play out
Well,
here?
and just going to a basic definition, I mean, populism is an approach that, it promotes the common people, and kind of casts people as salt of the earth and the others as the elite rich people. If you go back 100 years, it was the people who were in favor of the railroads. I mean, because this is not the first populist movement in South Dakota. It's actually happened back around the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it's something that split the Republican Party for decades. uh, they would have actually a Republican state convention with the populist groups, and then you would have with the more traditional one with the more traditional Republican groups, and then they would come together and have the general Republican group where they would both run. They'd run a populist candidate and then a regular Republican candidate. And so it's not the first time it's happened, and it's just they're they try to label and split members of the party. It's the pure people, the grassroots people, and those corrupt establishment elites. And it's not really very productive. uh they a few years back, it's still starting forever. There's you hear the term rhino, Republican in name only, and there's that's the really the slam that the populists would have against regular Republicans who maybe are not quite as hardcore conservative as they are, because they're more your traditional, what you might call your Eisenhower Republicans or your Reagan Republicans. They're a section of the party that's business and development oriented, who believes that we will see lower taxes through growth, as opposed to the populists who just say, well, cut the taxes and then we'll figure it out. And it doesn't always work that way.
Right. And so when we're looking at, I want to hold on to that split because we'll come back to that. But when we're
Yeah.
looking at what worked for Rhoden, then what do you think kind of helped push him over and win this?
Well, Rhoden is never been somebody who's, you would see as bombastic. You know, Larry's been around a long time. I mean, I've been acquainted with Larry for years, and you know, he's a good guy. He's not he's not fit to tangents where he's going off and talking about how he's going to upset the apple cart, and he's just gonna cut taxes. He's very much more deliberate. I mean, he had headed up the property tax force reviews in the past for the legislature, and they've they've tried to find ways to work within the present system without throwing it out, because South Dakota is a very conservative state to begin with, and the question is, how do you lower taxes when we've got them cut down to the bone? How do you cut government when government is cut down to the bone? Well, you're really kind of rearranging chairs, and because there's some funds that can't be cut unless we want to put our federal funding in danger for things like Medicaid and special education and other aspects of government funding where we rely heavily on partnerships with the federal government. So it's if you're coming in with like a Toby Doeden, you can come in and very irresponsibly say, well, we're just going to cut that. Well, you don't really have to go in and explain, well, we've lost 50 million in highway funding because we cut 5 million from what we're spending on roads. And Larry knows those things. things, and which is why, I think he is a lot more deliberate in what he says South Dakota can do.
Okay. And in these past 8 weeks, there's been a lot of other things kind of going on as this runoff has gone on. We had the Sioux Falls mayoral election that had taken some more time than anticipated. Some pretty significant endorsements. The Republican convention for the state. I guess, were there any kind of things throughout that 8 week run that really you think made a difference or had a big impact?
Well, at the end of the day, it didn't. I mean, as I said earlier, I think that it potentially was giving the impression that we were all sick of elections, and it could really affect this turnout, because you have a mayoral race, and then a mayoral runoff, and then the Republican convention, and it's just event after event after event. We don't have the breaks that we usually have. In fact, we're going to have to do this again, because the Democrats now want to reopen their own convention and try to swap out some candidates, or maybe add a candidate for attorney general. So we're not even done in this exhausting cycle where we don't really seem to have a summer break to go on vacation. So I think there was that danger that people were fatigued by it. I mean, I think I saw some interviews on TV where they talked about that they're tired of it, but you wouldn't have known last night with a 30% turnout, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, it was, I think Secretary of State's office said about 36%. And that's pretty.
That's tremendous. That is a huge turnout. I think a lot of them, I know, when I went in and voted, I voted early. My wife, my kids, I think there was a lot of early voting going on. And so that was just kind of the quiet, that was quite kind of the quiet effort. People just went and did it as it was convenient, as opposed to everybody showing up on election day, because election day, the turnout was very quiet, but they had banked so many votes. And I found it interesting that I don't know that either campaign really ran what you might consider a traditional get out the vote effort. You really didn't see that from either side. So you couldn't say one was stronger than the other in get out the vote effort, but they came out and they voted for Larry.
Yeah, that was kind of a sentiment that I had heard, and some of our other reporters had heard at the polls, was some folks weren't there necessarily to vote for Rhoden, but more so there to vote against Doeden, I guess.
Well, and that's the question is he going to come back at some point in the future? I mean, he spent 2 million uh, in the 2025 portion of the race. He spent 2 million in the pre-primary report, and which runs up until 2 weeks before the first primary. And then we had this 10-week stretch where he may have spent another million or two, and that's a lot of money if you're paying it out of pocket. So the question is he going to try to continue his movement, or is he going to step back and maybe retool and see what he could have done differently, or is he just done? I mean, if I had $5 or $6 million, I would not spend it on a campaign to be governor.
That's fair. That's fair. We saw too some of the legislators that might have aligned a little bit more with Doeden's platform not be successful in some of their primaries. Do you think that he has a chance at the state legislature?
Well, really, if you run for the state legislature, you're one of over 100 people. I think he views himself as being more on that statewide stage. So I don't know that you would see a Doeden campaign for the state legislature. I could see him running for a different office, maybe at the federal level, but uh, we'll see. We'll see. Politics are, it's about timing and opportunity, and we'll see what happens. And whether he decides to try to self fund again, or if he wants to go out in a traditional campaign and raise money. One thing that people don't understand, and I've talked to candidates to say, well, should just pay for this myself? And my advice has always been no, absolutely not. Because if somebody donates to you, that's a vote. That's their vote of confidence. Uh, that is them going and encouraging their friends, saying, hey, look, I went out and I supported this candidate. I hope you'll join me.
Right. And so I want to go back to that split that you talked a little bit about within the Republican Party here in the state. Um, Rhoden and Doeden obviously seem to align with two different sides of the Republican Party. Do you see Rhoden unifying the Republican Party before November, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think in this runoff, Larry has united the party as much as I think I've seen it being united for a while. He's going to go, as I said, he's going to go into this next session with a fairly friendly legislature. I think they're going to be strong, and they are going to have their own agenda. But I think they're friendlier than they would have been with Toby. You have to understand a lot of these. There's this block of legislators who was elected, and a lot of them were elected by people who were aligned with Dusty Johnson. I mean, Dusty, he may have lost the initial primary, but he you might say he saved the legislature, or at least created a legislative environment that Larry Rhoden's going to enjoy a lot more than he would have otherwise.
Okay. And is there any chance that the split in the Republican Party will cause some Republican voters to switch over and vote for the Democratic nominee, Dan Ahlers, here in November?
I don't know that they will. They would have to hear something from Dan that's directly oppositional to what Larry believes. And Larry is not what you might call a bomb thrower. Larry's more of a very traditional Republican, and he's going to be, as I said, very thoughtful and deliberate. I don't think he's prone to flights of wild fancy like Toby would have been. So that's going to complicate Dan's uphill battle, just like some of the Republicans who in the primary they left Toby alone because that's who they wanted to run against in a runoff. Democrats would have rather had Toby in a runoff. So now they've got Larry. They've got an incumbent governor who's again proven himself to be pretty steady, and so they're going to have to provide contrast as to why Dan Ahlers is a better choice than Larry Rhoden, and that's going to be a tougher hill for them to climb. They can't really say, well, he's the MAGA Republican. Well, Larry is Larry. He got in without any endorsements from anybody, and what you see is what you get. So now they have to draw a difference between Larry's record and what they would have done if Democrats were in charge. And traditionally in South Dakota, that has not been a message that has sold very well for them in the last 40, 50 years.
Is there anything, that's kind of all of my questions that I have. Do you have anything else that you want to mention, or anything else that?
I think this is a great opportunity for the governor to continue to help right the ship in the Republican Party, to maybe help get a little more stability for the state Republican Party. I think it's right now everything is Larry's to do with as he will, and I think he's going to set us on a good path for the next legislative session. and we'll have to just see what comes after that.
Okay, sounds good. Well, that's everything. I appreciate your time and you joining again. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Rhoden will face Ahlers for the governorship on the November ballot. That's all we have for this episode of Searchlight Report. Audio for this episode of the podcast came from recordings by South Dakota Searchlight. The podcast is based on reporting by South Dakota Searchlight's staff, editor Seth Tupper, senior reporter John Holt, and reporters Joshua Heyer, Mackenzie Huber, and me. I write the scripts and produce the audio with editing by Seth Tupper. South Dakota Searchlight is part of States Newsroom, the nation's largest nonprofit news organization. Until next time, I'm South Dakota Searchlight's Megan O'Brien with the Searchlight Report.